Okay. Guess we'll give a minute for people to move. Okay. We don't have that much time. So I'll jump into it. Quick introduction. I'm Damian Mencher. I'm working at Google. I am not a network engineer. But I do focus on networks related security issues. So, when Google goes down, yeah, everyone panics. I panic, especially if it's related to a network security issue, like a DOS attack. Because I focus on DOS, I write horrible, evil pages like this that serve you CAPTCHAs. I'm sorry. I know you hate me. Before Google, I was doing particle physics. So I'm really not a network engineer, but I do have a bit of a scientific background. Hopefully, I can give you some interesting commentary. So today's talk, I'm going to be covering DOS attacks in general and going over sort of some general classifications of attacks. I'm going to survey some prior approaches to this problem of DOS attacks and why they failed. And then I'm going to wrap up with a solution to the problem, an actual practical solution that we can implement, and discuss ways to remediate attacks, even if there are sort of uncooperative sources of abuse. Just to give an example, this graph shows a legitimate traffic to one of our services in green. The red is attack traffic. So that gives you a sense of scale of what these things can look like. OK, so let's get started. Obviously, there's a lot of news headlines. Big high bandwidth attacks are always out there, always seem to be increasing. Obviously, they're not going to decrease. Nobody's going to report on that. But when you sort of look at this, you have to think there are terabit scale attacks out there. Do the criminals have access to terabit scale networks? Probably not, right? They're doing something else. And so you need to think a little bit about how these attacks are being generated. Turns out it doesn't require a lot of skill. You can find services out there called booters or stressors. You pay them a small monthly fee, and they give you access to a large variety of attack styles, right? So this is sort of how these attacks are generally happening. Obviously, there are more advanced things out there that, this is the bottom tier of their pricing structure. I didn't bother showing the top tiers for VIPs. But how are they doing this? Obviously, there's, if you want to disrupt a target that's larger than yourself, you need to bypass this resource constraint somehow, right? You have a limited amount of bandwidth available to you. Maybe you have a server in a data center with a gig uplink, but you want to generate much more than a gig, right? So somehow you have to figure out how to use other people's resources. Now, an obvious way to do this is through a botnet, right? You compromise a lot of machines, and that gives you a lot of resources, right? All the resources of those machines. But this is kind of difficult to do, right? When you think about it, you have to have some skill in order to figure out how to compromise all of these machines. You need a vulnerability in them, or you need to be able to guess that the default root password is root. That takes some skill. But also, when you consider the amount of skill that's required there's resource contention, right? Typically, if you compromise a machine, you don't want to be sharing that with another kid who's also compromised that machine, right? You want that all to yourself. And so there's a bit of contention over this pool of vulnerable devices. We saw this particularly with Mirai. So some of you may remember it was late 2016. Mirai was this really big threat, right? It caused fairly large DOS attacks, like 623 gig, I think was the peak reported. That was pretty scary, but then they published the source code, right? And what happens immediately after that? Well, now there are 20 Mirai botnets. And it turns out that's not worse, right? That's actually a really big benefit to everyone, because if there are 20 Mirai botnets, each one only gets like 5% of the bots. And therefore, now you have a lot of little attacks that you can just absorb. And the other interesting thing about botnets is victims are incentivized to patch, right? If your bandwidth is totally toast because of being infected, you're going to want to fix that. So I don't worry too much about botnets because it's sort of a self-regulating problem. But there are sort of other methods out there. So something to consider is with, for example, DNS. If you make this very brief query for cpsc.gov and you ask it for everything, it gives you this massive response, right? Now, is that a problem? Well, think about this. It occurs over UDP, right? So imagine you're this evil cat. Cat pics are a necessity at Nanog, right, on the internet. So imagine you're an evil cat, and you want to attack somebody. Well, you can make a request with a source IP of your victim to a DNS server out there or any other type of UDP service that will give a larger response, right? And because you gave the source IP of your packet as the victim, that large response will go to your poor victim, right? And that victim is pretty much toast. To give you an example, the size that you can increase the bandwidth is a factor of 100 times, maybe even 1,000 times. There are some protocols where you can get even more, right? So that means that this attacker who has a 1 gig uplink from their server hosted somewhere can actually generate a terabit scale attack from their single machine. How do you know if you're getting hit by one of these? Well, it turns out that, here's an example of an attack that we saw in 2017. When you're receiving one of these, because you're receiving the responses from these servers, you see the source port is that server's, the port that server was listening on. So in this case, you can look at this attack, and you see that very frequently the source port was 53. This was a DNS amplification attack coming to us. You'll also see if you're using NetFlow, a lot of source port 0, those are packet fragments. So obviously the fragment doesn't contain a port number, right? And that gets reported as 0. As I sort of alluded to earlier, I don't want to imply that DNS is the only problematic protocol. There are several. This is on a log scale, but an example of a day of attacks that we saw to multiple victims. So the one that's standing out here, port 11211, is memcached. But you can also see here NTP, CLDAP, NTP, I don't know why I said NTP twice, SSDP, and fascinating, there was an attack I'd never noticed before, quote of the day, if anyone remembers that. So how do we defend against these? Well, obviously you have to be able to absorb the traffic somehow, right? So fat pipes. And it helps to have global peering. You don't want it to be able to aggregate in any single location. And you can use ACLs to sort of rate limit how much traffic you're letting into your network. Obviously, you don't want to completely block. The idea of the ACL is you want something that's throttling at a level that you can manage, and the higher you set that, the safer you're going to be, right? Or safer in the sense that you're not going to affect legitimate traffic unless you absolutely have to. These ACLs can be directional, so they only need to filter stuff coming into your network from one of the source ports that can be used for amplification. And you can also write your ACL so that it's limited in the size of the packet, right? If you're getting a small DNS response, that's not likely to be part of an attack. In terms of what we're seeing for growth, here's an example. I've been watching this for over 10 years. So I put this on a log scale because any other way it just blows up too fast and you can't see anything. But you'll see that this is going up pretty quickly even on a log scale. So think of this as exponential growth. That shouldn't surprise anyone. If you've heard of Moore's law, like computers tend to get exponentially better over time. That applies to everything related to computers. There's also an explosion in the internet, right? There are more devices out there, which means you're going to have not only more bandwidth per device or more compute power per device, but also more devices participating. So when I look at this, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a 5 terabit attack right now. Like, I don't know if that would surprise anybody here. I hope it doesn't. But 5 terabits is sort of the expected value. When I mention this to my company's leadership, they say, OK, well, what if that's just your prediction of average? What if it's above average? What if it's 10 terabits? Right? So you sort of think about it. Like, who here is prepared for a 10 terabit attack? You have 10 T of spare capacity. OK, I see one hand. Only one? Two. OK. 2 hands. Great. What are the rest of you planning to do? Like, maybe this is a problem. OK. So that's sort of the motivation for this talk. So first, I want to go over like what others have done, because obviously a lot of work has been done in this area before. Some people have talked about maybe UDP is the problem, right? UDP doesn't require a handshake at session setup, and therefore it can be spoofing is an issue for it. Should we just block all UDP? Like, UDP should be forbidden on the internet. I think that's probably not a great solution. You're going to cause a lot of problems for existing things like DNS. Also quick, a lot of games use UDP because of the latency improvement, voice protocols. And also, this doesn't actually fully solve the problem. There's the concept out there of TCP amplification, right? So if you send a SYN packet to somebody, they're going to send a SYN-ACK back. What if you don't respond to that SYN-ACK? They're going to send you another SYN-ACK. What if you don't respond to that? Well, they'll do exponential backoff, but they're going to send you another SYN-ACK, right? And it's pretty common to see like maybe a factor of 5 amplification just in terms of SYN-ACKs. So this isn't purely a UDP problem. This can apply to TCP as well. Another idea that people have proposed is cleaning up the amplifiers, right? So there are some great projects that have been used to track how many amplifiers are there. So right now, I think there's around 16 million DNS servers out there that can be used for amplification. So we could try to clean all of those up. There are changes that we can make. Similar with NTP, there's about 4 million of those. You can change the default packages to not allow for amplification. But that's going to take a very long time to roll out, right? So even if we do this today, and best case scenario, you imagine like, we get on the news, we get everyone to update, and we get a 99.9% success rate. Like, that would be so amazing. Like, look at all these people who patched. You've accomplished absolutely nothing, right? There's still going to be enough amplifiers out there that they can still cause these 10 terabit attacks. So I don't think this is, it's great to clean up amplifiers. It's good for your own bandwidth if you've been wasting your bandwidth amplifying attacks for others. But this isn't a solution to the problem. Another thing, BCP 38. I assume everybody here has heard about it because it's 20 years old and gets brought up basically every year. Everyone's saying, hey, if everybody were a good citizen, then there would be no problems. That's sort of a generic statement, not just for the internet. It turns out there's something like 60,000 ASs out there, right? That sounds like a large number, but keep in mind this is like 1,000 times smaller than the number of amplifiers out there. So like we've already constrained the number of people we would need to convince to take action. And also, if you own an AS, you're probably a bit more technical than the average home user. So this does seem like it's the right direction to go. But obviously, this has been out for 20 years, and there hasn't been much progress. And so I've thought a lot about why isn't there much progress there. And part of this is the lack of awareness, right? Like there are networks, some new network up there, maybe they don't come to Nanog as often as they should. And they might be sending spoof traffic out and not aware that they're doing it or that it's a problem, right? So they just need to be informed. There's also a difficulty with lack of accountability. It turns out that if nobody knows that you're sending this abuse, then you can't really be held responsible for it, so not really your problem. So there's no strong incentive for people to clean up because they can't really be traced anyway. There's an interesting analogy here to like pollution, right? If you're polluting, it's sort of bad for everyone, but nobody can really pin it on you specifically without significant effort. Okay, so I feel like, there's been a lot of guesses at solutions, but rather than guessing, I think maybe we should just try to design a solution. So, what goes into designing a good solution to this problem? Well, one way I think of it is you're going to make progress if you have people be incentivized to make a change, right? You need some incentive. And you also need to have as few people involved as possible, right? Obviously, you can't have millions of people adjust their behavior. Even tens of thousands might be too many, right? So you need to try to minimize how many people are involved. So first, I want to try to reduce that number of 60,000 ASNs to, can we identify just the problematic ones? And how would we go about doing that? Well, it turns out, in order to launch one of these attacks, you're typically reflecting off of a very, very large number of devices. So, thousands or tens of thousands of DNS servers or NTP servers, depending on whatever the attack style is, right? The attacker has no choice but to reflect off a lot of them. And in addition to that, they need them to be spread out sort of across the entire internet. it doesn't help me to find like, 1,000 DNS servers all at a single hosting provider or at a single ISP, because basically you're just going to knock that ISP off the internet when they try to send this much to their upstream, right? So you do want it globally distributed. So we can use this to our advantage, because this means that you basically have a window into the attacker's traffic, right? They're trying to reflect off of servers if you have any of these servers on your network. Now, you could set up one of these servers on your network, but fortunately for most of us, we have customers who do that for us, right? It's the great thing about customers. So they're already running this infrastructure on our behalf, right? All we have to do is look at our data to take advantage of that information that they're collecting. So we need to figure out how to identify where these packets are entering our network, the spoofed packets coming from the attacker. So one simple thing you could do is router counters, right? If you deploy a term like this on your routers, this is basically just looking for UDP packets that are destined to amplification ports, right? So ports that are commonly used by attackers for launching amplification attacks. If you put this on your routers, then you get like a per link count of where this traffic is coming from. And that'll give you a great insight into if any of your peers are likely the source of these types of attacks, right? Obviously, if you're a leaf node and your only peer is a transit provider, this isn't going to be very helpful to you. But if you have a lot of peers, then this can be used essentially for some form of traceback. Now, keep in mind, this isn't going to show up. This is only going to show like the largest attacks. But as you get closer to the source, these things are very focused, right? The spoof traffic is probably coming from only one or two original sources. And so as you get nearer to that, it's easier to see it. And this is certainly a lot easier than like trying to get a packet capture on your router and then look and see which port it came in on and then go to that router, right? If you have any monitoring of your network infrastructure with router counters, this is an easy one to add that'll give you a great visibility. But still, that's a bit of a pain. Much easier, if you can do it, is NetFlow or SFlow. So, obviously, here, like a lot of people should have NetFlow. It's really sort of essential for debugging any traffic weirdness. So I strongly encourage it. I know some people are nervous about having NetFlow. They have concerns about the size of the data that they're collecting. But keep in mind, this can be sampled. So you can reduce the amount of data you have to receive. You can address privacy concerns with a two-week retention period. It's very rare for anybody to need you to trace an attack that happened more than a few days ago. And then analysis is also typically a problem. I recommend putting it into some sort of database. And there are open source solutions that allow for that. To give an example of how this can be used, I'm showing some actual data from our NetFlow from recent past, where I'm just saying for each peering link, tell me how many source ASs we saw over that single peering link, right? So the top one here is an internet exchange. This exchange has 29 connected networks. Some of them may have a customer cone with additional downstream members, but I find it hard to believe that there are really 44,000 ASs that somehow have a customer cone that comes up through this single peering exchange. So this is sort of a very rough way of getting a sense of where attacks might be coming from. Obviously, if you have full NetFlow data, you can do a much more detailed analysis, looking at the specific ports and filtering on UDP or whatever you want. But I'm not trying to shame people here. Obviously, some of these may be legitimate or not. I'm just trying to show that this is actually possible. I don't want people to come away thinking that I'm pitching something that can't actually be done. And obviously, here this is just the top 20, right? There are many more. Are there projects out there to identify where these spoof packets are potentially coming from? Yes, there are. CADA is a big one that everyone sort of knows about. I have often questioned about biases in their data. Is something I worry a little bit about, because users have to sort of opt into this, right? So they're acting under the assumption that users are acting independently of their hosting provider. So a user will opt in for most hosting providers, and they get a pretty good sense of data. I'm not sure how accurate that is, right? That's an assumption. I worry that there are some hosting providers that are malicious, and the users know that they're malicious, and therefore the users maybe aren't subscribing to this data. And there also isn't really any enforcement there. So I've sort of looked for our own source of data on this as a cross-check on the CADA data. And one time we had a really fortunate thing happen, which is we got hit by a botnet. Botnets are great. It turns out that this botnet was spoofing packets. And so now I have a globally distributed, not exactly opt-in source of information on where spoofed packets can originate from. And so this came from a pretty large number of places. I've blurred out the ASs here because, again, I'm not really trying to name and shame. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how large the problem is. And this gives you a sense that the problem isn't actually all that large. Right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of places, a lot of peering exchanges have issues, probably because the smaller networks are not as well maintained as the larger ones that we peer directly with. But it also helps you to realize that this isn't really an issue of 60,000 ASs. This is maybe only an issue of 1% of those, right? And so that's a much more tractable problem. So another thing to keep in mind here is imagine, previously I'd mentioned if you clean up 99.9% of reflectors, you've accomplished absolutely nothing. But imagine if you clean up one AS that an attacker was using. What does that attacker have to do? Well, now they have to go hunting around for another AS to send their spoof traffic from. So you've knocked out like part of their business, and you might have even taken out multiple attackers in that single change. And then as you take out the attackers, it'll be easier to find the new ones because you've sort of constrained the problem, and you're now focusing, you're making their job harder as you make progress, and you're making your job easier. So this has a really nice benefit. So obviously, lots of ASs will clean up if they're aware of the problem, but what if they don't, right? Now what? So, well, there's been a lot of study into this area as well. One idea is URPF. So the idea here is that you see a peer advertising that they own a particular range, and then they ask, hey, will you accept a packet from a different range? And you say no, right? Well, this has some problems, which most people here are aware, but just for those who aren't, there are issues with asymmetric routing. So maybe somebody wants to send you traffic over one link, but receive it over a different link for some reason for their traffic engineering purposes. Also, this requires you to do twice as many route lookups, right? For every packet you're receiving, you have to also look to see where it came from. And so there are performance implications on the routers, and that makes this not very feasible. Another idea, though, is what about ACLs, right? This is similar to URPF, except you can define it in advance. It's not quite as automated, right? You would have to define something to roll it out, but these things can operate at line rate. And so that's a really great way to do this because you don't have to worry about the performance implications or the asymmetric routing, because if you're aware of asymmetric routing in advance, you can just program that into your ACL to allow for it. Some people wonder, well, how many ACL, how many entries does this take, and is it really feasible? So I did some very basic checking. Our network has aggregates into 500 CIDRs. Amazon is about 3,000. China Telecom, which is very massive, they have 14,000 prefixes they announce, but those actually aggregate together very well into only about 470 prefixes. Now, obviously, not everyone needs to make this change. It turns out that there are better places for enforcement. The attacker, in order to get their traffic from their source network out into the public internet, they probably don't peer with every AS out there, right? Nobody does. And so typically, they're going through a transit provider. This means that transit providers provide sort of a natural choke point for filtering out abuse. And so we could try to incentivize transit providers to do this. I've listed here various ways of reasons that they might want to do this. Obviously, they might just want to be proactive. It's probably in their interest for the internet to be stable. But there are other things there that could come into play, right? They might be receiving a lot of abuse complaints from everyone here when you see an attack, or they might have law enforcement asking them where attacks came from. which they can easily trace with their NetFlow. There could be economic incentives of maybe you prefer to use a transit provider that does this, right? So I think that this is sort of where things are headed, or where I hope things are headed. But I just want to close with what I want people to keep in mind. So obviously, software vendors, like, we don't want to allow amplification if we can avoid it. When you're designing new protocols or modifying existing protocols, try to minimize that. Network providers, you obviously should be filtering or you're required, I will say, to filter your outbound network traffic. And if you're receiving an attack, you should feel free to ask your transit provider where that attack is coming from and ask them to filter that out so that it doesn't come to you, right? And finally, the thing that I'd like to add that's new to this is that transit providers should be using NetFlow to figure out where spoof traffic is originating on the internet. They are in a great position to do this, and they can definitely do that. And then they should notify those customers and say, hey, are you aware that you're sending this spoof traffic? And if the customer is aware they're doing it, and they continue to do it and refuse to do anything about it, then consider applying an ACL, and you can cut off this attack traffic completely, right? And you don't have to apply ACLs to everyone. You only have to do that for the problematic customers. So with that, I will conclude and open it up for questions. Anybody? Anyone awake? Okay.
All right, I'll do the duty. Tony Tauber, Comcast again. The slide you had where you said the number of source ASNs that, sorry.
Let's see if I can find it.
To the whistly mic. Several back, the blurry ASN slide. Oh, yeah.
This?
What are you saying there? Like, what's your methodology for figuring out what these ASNs are doing, we're doing to you in that one?
Right, so at this time, we're receiving a DOS attack, which was spoofing sources. And so some of those sources are spoofed from ranges that we know are obviously not legitimate. So for example, our own IP space coming into our network from the outside, or RFC 1918 or whatever. So basically with our NetFlow, I was able to look for where these sources are coming into our network and tie that to a single peering link. And then I can look up who is on the other side of that wire, right? Or fiber, right?
So the traffic, so an example of like a DNS amplification, they are using your IP address and then the DNS server's IP address. That's the packet you're getting, right?
So this was not a DNS amplification attack to generate this data. This was like a spoof SYN flood.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. In that case, I think I see how it could work out. So it was different.
Yeah.
Makes sense. No, it would be good to get that kind of data, and with maybe for a future project to mash it with, say, spoofer and see kind of where overlaps are and aren't, and maybe that would be interesting. Right.
Yeah. I think a challenge here is I can't collect this data whenever I want. I need to convince a botnet to attack me. So I only get occasional snapshots.
Consider it a challenge? No, I don't know.
Yeah. I love attacks. They're fun. Thanks. Anything else? Good.